This is Colorado Matters from CPR News. I'm RyanWarner. How many times have you been on a flight and heard something like this?
Ladies and gentlemen, we are going through an area of turbulence. We ask all passengers to please remain seated with your seatbelt fastened. Thank you.
Well, you may hear more announcements like that because of climate change. A study from the University of Reading in England finds turbulence could get 2 to 3 times worse if carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere continue to rise. In other climate news, you may have heard that 2016 was the 5th hottest year on record in Colorado. As part of CPR's ongoing climate coverage, we're going to talk through these issues and other developments with 2 Colorado scientists. ScottDenning is a professor of atmospheric science at Colorado State University, and JimWhite directs the Institute of Arctic and Alpine Research at CU Boulder. Gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Good morning. Glad to be here.
Scott, in layman's terms, what's the science behind these turbulence findings?
Well, I think, frankly, increased airplane turbulence is probably among the least of our worries with regard to climate change. But the reason why that study found the increase in the future has to do with driving the jet stream harder and having more planes in a faster wind regime up at the altitudes where jet planes fly. As somebody who flies quite a bit, I guess it kind of makes my stomach twitch a little bit, but it's probably more like damage to the world economy we ought to be worried about rather than bumps on airplanes.
And yet I wonder if a study like this is a way to bring climate change, which can feel like a really big issue, home to people, if not through scary means.
Well, bumps on airplanes, no water for your yard, hard to grow crops in Colorado, fires and droughts and floods, oh my. I don't know. Airplane turbulence seems kind of far down on the list to me.
Now, this study says that these effects would be noticed if there were a doubling of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that as a result, severe clear air turbulence would increase by 149%. I guess I'd like a clearer picture on whether a doubling of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is even in the cards. How would you answer that, Jim?
Oh, I think it's in the cards. Keep in mind we're doubling from a level of pre-industrial, which is about 280 parts per million. So 560 is what we consider doubling. We're at 400 right now. We can get there. If we don't do anything about CO2 production, we will get there by the end of this century.
I'll say that this was published in a journal called Advances in Atmospheric Sciences, and indeed it has to do with effects of the jet stream, as you said, this high-altitude channel of fast-flowing air. JimWhite, I know you're not in the airline industry, but do you think that those who operate airlines ought to be concerned about this?
Yes, I certainly think that they ought to pay attention to it. The changes that we've seen on the planet and will continue to see are not all positive. And as we learn more about how the atmosphere is going to respond, and Scott's your expert here, I would take a cue from him. I think we do need to pay attention to what's going on in the atmosphere. It will change, and if indeed it's more turbulence, that's not going to make me happy either.
I think that something everyone in Colorado can relate to is weather closer to the ground, whether it's ski seasons that get shorter, temperatures that appear to be rising. According to the Colorado Climate Center, 2016 was the 5th hottest year in recorded history in the state, with temperatures averaging 47.3 degrees. It's about 2.7 degrees above normal. Worldwide, 2016 was the hottest year since scientists began tracking data in 1880. JimWhite, you recently attended a seminar at A Basin that focused on climate change in the ski industry. How concerned were folks there?
I think folks are very concerned. Skiing is one of those activities that defines us here in Colorado. It's also a multi-billion-dollar injection into our economy. We pay attention to snow, and skiing requires 3 things. It requires cold, and that's becoming in less common supply. It requires water, which is a real issue, and it requires gravity. Unfortunately, gravity we've got in abundance.
I want to look at these numbers in particular related to temperature because according to the state climatologist Nolan Deskin, the hottest year on record goes to 2012. And then some of the hottest years were way back, like 1934 and 1954. So, Scott, when you hear that and people think, well, gosh, there have been hot years in the past, what's different? Why do you say this is climate change? How do you answer that?
Well, the temperature here in Colorado goes up and down year to year for a bunch of different reasons. I mean, a lot of it has to do with, air masses blowing in and blowing out, the kind of day-to-day changes in the weather. Climate change is driven globally. It's the whole atmosphere that is trapping the heat of the sun because of the extra CO2. So you really get a much better read on climate change when you look at the average temperature across much bigger regions than just Colorado. On the other hand, let's think about the years that you just described. I mean, you talk about 2012. Here in Fort Collins, that was the High Park fire year. Hundreds of homes burned, horrific drought. We had smoke here in Fort Collins for pretty much the whole summer. My mom died of lung disease during those fires.
Oh, my.
34, I think you said, 1930, mid-30s.
Yeah, exactly.
That was the Dust Bowl. Hot years are not pleasant around here. It's not a matter of airplane turbulence. It's more like catastrophic fire and drought and farmers going out of business and losing our forests. Think about what that does to the snow, as in your previous question. Besides skiing, the snow is where we get all our water. Snowpack is far and away the biggest reservoir we have. That's where all of the water for 5.5 million people in Colorado comes from. That's where all of our agriculture water comes from runoff. It's really a lot closer to home when you think about the impact of those hot years like that on our water supply, on our forests, sure, on our ski industry.
And I imagine more salient to you than turbulence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Probably more salient to most people.
Yeah. JimWhite, what would you add?
I agree with Scott 100%. What makes us Colorado is water, and we don't have that substance in abundance, and we need to pay very, very careful attention to it. We don't want to become a very dry, deserty place. We need that water. And the future predictions for warmer and warmer climates tell us that we're going to have less and less water available to us, particularly in the summertime. And snow is indeed the biggest reservoir we have, and it's free. It doesn't cost us. We don't have to dig holes in the ground. We don't have to drown beautiful rivers in order to collect that water. And that may be our future if the planet continues to warm up.
I think what was really important to note there that you said, Scott, is that it's not enough to look at 1 year's temperature in one spot on the globe. That in order to understand the forces at play, you have to take a more global view. Just as a consumer of news, I think that's important to understand. You're listening to Colorado Matters. I'm RyanWarner, and we are talking through some climate news with ScottDenning, professor of atmospheric science at Colorado State University, and JimWhite, who directs the Institute of Arctic and Alpine Research at CU Boulder. And I'd like to talk about climate change as it relates to the new administration. So we've seen, of course, Scott Pruitt become the head of the Environmental Protection Agency, an agency he sued when he was Attorney General of Oklahoma. According to the New York Times, shortly after President Donald Trump took office, nearly all mentions of climate change programs from the White House and State Department websites were purged, and the administration ordered a freeze on federal grant spending at the EPA and other government agencies. I'll say that some, like the EPA, were ordered to stop posting news and information online. Now, some of these orders, like the one covering the EPA, have since been lifted, important to note. Also concerning to the scientific community was a report late last month that Republican mega donors Robert Mercer and his daughter Rebecca attended something called the Heartland Institute Conference in Washington. It's regularly reported that the pair carry a great deal of influence with President Trump, and the Heartland is well known for, according to the Washington Post, embracing views that have long been considered outlier positions by the scientific community. ScottDenning, you've attended the Heartland Conference, I think, 3 times. Can you give us a sense of some of the stances they've taken there that appear to run contrary to the work being done by scientists like you?
Yeah, I've been 3 times to their conferences, once in Chicago and once in Washington, D.C., and then at their sort of home office in the suburbs outside of Chicago. They push very hard the sort of contrarian line that CO2 is not going to warm the climate, that climate change is good. I mean, it's sort of a different story. Each speaker, you hear that that climate isn't going to warm, but then you hear that warming is good. You hear that CO2 has no effect, but then on the other hand, they'll tell you that CO2 is wonderful because it grows plants. It seems a little disjointed to me. It's quite an influential group. When I went first time, probably 600 people came to the conference. They had 78 speakers in 3 days, and I was the only mainstream scientist at the conference, only one to sort of give the regular scientific view.
Why do you go? Is it for that reason?
Well, people have argued that scientists shouldn't go to these things because it just sort of legitimizes it, and I guess that's a point. But ignoring them hasn't made them go away either. My view is that engaging people in an honest and authentic way, you can't go wrong by talking with people. I go in open-minded. I speak from my heart. I speak the truth as I see it, and I find that to be reasonably effective. I mean, compared to just ignoring it.
Have you ever changed a mind there?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I did. Probably not the organizers, right? Not the people that run Heartland, but I spoke to a room of 600 people in a giant Marriott in downtown Chicago. And when I first got up, lots of crossed arms and sort of angry looks. But during the course of a 30-minute talk, they visibly loosened up. They were laughing at my jokes, nodding their heads, smiling a little bit. And then probably the most rewarding thing was that when they ran into me during the conference, like in the hallway or the bathroom or the bar at night, dozens of people came up to me and said, "Thank you so much for coming. I never really thought about it this way." So I hope I changed some minds.
Will you continue to go?
Yeah, I'd go again.
Okay.
Absolutely. I think talking to people is better than not talking to them.
JimWhite, after the president took office, there was a lot of talk about research grants being rescinded, federal money drying up. In the 2015-16 fiscal year, the CU Boulder campus alone received approximately $332 million in federal research money. Wonder if you might take us into your world, into your laboratory. Are you and your peers feeling pressure to make sure, projects are complete, lest funding dries up?
We are definitely having conversations about it. We understand how the federal government works. The president submits a budget. It's actually Congress that passes the budget. Mm-hmm. So we'll find out whether or not Congress goes along with the White House in terms of the budget recommendations. But the budget recommendations from the White House were very clear. They did not think that climate-related spending was productive, and they didn't want to spend money on it. It flies in the face of physics, and you can't do that for very long and survive. So I'm hopeful that cooler heads will prevail in Congress, and that they'll recognize that, number one, it's a very small amount of money that we spend in terms of the total amount we spend. But number two, it's extremely important for keeping us prepared for changing climate, for sea level rise, for all the things that we know, because the physics is indeed simple. We know it's going to happen, and we need to be prepared. We don't want to be caught short. money spent now will save many, many times over that money down the road in probably and hopefully better policy and better approaches.
Climate change, an awfully heavy topic, gentlemen. I wonder if we might end on a hopeful note. If you could each give us an example of something, I don't know, you're working on or that you've been made aware of about climate change research that has you excited. ScottDenning?
Yeah, there was a paper last year by actually one of Jim's colleagues at NOAA in Boulder regarding the transmission grid, the electrical transmission grid. I don't know if you realize, but our AC power, alternating current power, only can be transmitted about 300 miles from where it is generated. Imagine a world where every car had to be built within 300 miles of where you buy it, or every piece of electronics that you buy had to be made right here.
Huh.
That would be crazy, but that's how we do our electricity. The new approach is direct current, DC, transmission grid run through the right-of-ways and the median strips of freeways. And, you could imagine generating solar power in Arizona and using it at night in New York, or, wind power from Iowa powering the lights and heat in Seattle. Long-distance transmission would really revolutionize the opportunity for renewable energy on our grid.
And this paper sees that as a closer possibility?
Yeah, it turns out actually quite cost-effective. You could probably reduce CO2 emissions in the United States 80% in the electricity sector by 2030 at no increase in the cost of electricity.
JimWhite, what would you leave us with?
I think it's important to recognize that the long-term goal here is a sustainable future for our children, grandchildren, et cetera. And the pathway to sustainability, as it turns out, is paved with what I would call good actions and good intentions. A good example of that is we are going to have to get population under control. We don't like to talk about it. It's sort of the third rail of conversations. But the key to population control, and demographers will tell this over and over again, is the empowerment of women. When women have greater economic power, greater political power, they tend to have fewer children per woman. They have those children later. And population, as we've seen in industrialized countries, the population growth rate slows down. So, guys, share power. It is not only good for you, but it's good for the planet.
A holistic view there from JimWhite, who directs the Institute of Arctic and Alpine Research at CU Boulder. We heard from ScottDenning, professor of atmospheric science at Colorado State University, and they reflected with us on some of the climate change stories in the news. We'd like to hear from you. What questions do you have about climate change or the science behind it? Or maybe you've taken your own steps to address the issue in your own way. Share that with us too. You're welcome to email news@cpr.org, news@cpr.org. This is Colorado Matters from CPR News.